Okay.
We ready to start?
Okay.
Okay. And so what we're talking about tonight is helping children be resilient and instilling hope. And I'm going to do these a little separate because I think we're looking at two really different skill sets when you're working with kids and trying to work with this. So we're starting with, and I'm assuming, Becky, that everybody got handouts. Did they get handouts?
Yes, they did.
Okay. So we're starting with the resiliency, and I want to start by, we've talked about this some in terms of transitioning to online school and so on, but I want to reiterate again that this is one of those times when we really need to have resiliency skills and tools, and that there's a lot of complexity right now. So there's not only COVID, which everyone's aware of, and all of the changes, school, social, physical, etc., that come with that, but there's the intense political climate that everyone's dealing with. We've had some pretty serious environmental challenges in the last 6 months. We had the whole Black Lives Matter issue, and then on top of all that, we've been isolated through it. So understandably, there are all kinds of emotions. There's grief, thoughts of grief and loss. There's disappointment and fear and uncertainty and frustration. All of that, resentment, all of that is in play. And so I want people to understand that everything right now is incredibly amplified. All the sort of experiences your kids are having, all the experiences you're having, when you have this many things interfacing with each other, it amplifies all of them. So that's what we call amplification. And as a result of that amplification, then we have to be even more conscious about what is it we need to do to be sure our kids are able to be resilient. Now, I want to talk for a minute about a little bit about what resiliency is. So, resiliency is the ability to bounce back or what we call overcome adversity. There's no question that your kids are struggling with some adversity right now. And that's the whole idea of actually learning about resiliency, is that this is what's going to happen to them all through their lives, that they are going to have periods of time where they are going to experience adversity. And our job as parents and educators is to be sure that they have the tools in order to bounce back from adversity. So this isn't something that I want people to give the impression that they shouldn't experience, or to give their kids the idea that this is an unusual situation and that this isn't going to happen again. This is going to happen over and over again in their lives. And we're a generation of people who basically have raised our kids very child focused, which in many ways has been wonderful, much more humanitarian. They're much more emotionally intelligent. We have better, for the most part, better parent-child relationships. There's a lot of good things that came out of that. One of the challenges that has come from that is that we focused way more on protecting our children from having uncomfortable feelings or uncomfortable situations, and less time on making them resilient when they occurred. And so the whole idea is that there's a certain amount of limitation in terms of protecting our kids, as we're well aware of now with COVID, that there's no way we could have protected them from this. So now we have to look at what are the tools that we need to have in play. So what I'm going to start with are what we call the anchors of resiliency. What are the basis of the skills or tools that we need in order for them to be resilient? So the first one is strong attachment. And when we first started doing research on resiliency, that was one of the first things that came up in terms of what makes people resilient is strong attachment. Now, about the same time as that research was being done, we were also seeing an increase in restructured families, divorces, kids living in two homes, kids living in single parent homes, single parents, all kinds of changes in family dynamics. And there was some anxiety about what was this going to mean in terms of children's resilience. Well, the good news is, as they continued to research, what they found was it only takes one unconditional attachment to make someone resilient. And that attachment doesn't even have to be necessarily a parent. It can be a grandparent, it can be a beloved teacher. So the good news is that if they have a strong attachment to someone, then they have what they need to be resilient. Okay, the second one is intelligence. Now, this one is interesting because what we found through research is that it doesn't necessarily make you more resilient to be more what we call traditionally intelligent. If you have average traditional intelligence, IQ, you have enough to be resilient. That will make you resilient. However, what we did find was that the more emotionally intelligent you are, the more resilient you are. So if there was anything you were going to be working on with your kids, it would be to increase their emotional intelligence. And that would be things like recognizing feelings, managing their emotions, managing other people's emotions, recognize when their emotions get in the way of function, like problems, like decision making, um, to be able to have empathy, to know how to make people safe in new situations. So there are a lot of tools that are going to make your kids more resilient in terms of emotional intelligence. So if we have kids with normal IQs, then the focus needs to be at this point on emotional intelligence to increase their resiliency. So questions about any of that before I go on?
No questions so far.
Okay, good. All right, the next one is authentic self-esteem. And authentic self-esteem is simply that ability to be authentically who you are. And in terms of how you help your children with authentic self-esteem, what we know is children with who have authentic or the greatest authentic self-esteem are by far more resilient, particularly in situations where they have to be. Like, we know ironically that kids who are more self-defined and more authentic actually do better in middle school. And so as parents, the thing that I want you conscious of is to not undermine that authentic self-esteem, which is one of the things that we tend to do, again, because we have been so protective, that we have wanted our kids to be sure they were going to be liked, be sure that they were going to be doing things that would make them popular or acceptable with their peers, etc. And so we would do things like say, you need to do something with your hair. Your hair is a mess. You have to fix your hair. Or we would say their clothes didn't match from the time they were really young. So that very quickly, parents are the first ones who actually undermine their kids' authentic self-esteem. So their authentic self-esteem is anything that allows them to authentically express who they are as individuals. So that would be their clothing style, how they like their hair, what books they like to read, how they laugh, how they walk, um, what they find humorous. There are all these things that we as human beings have our own unique, authentic selves. And your job as a parent is not to undermine the confidence in that authentic self. So that's what we talk about when we talk about authentic self-esteem. The next one are constructive coping mechanisms, and I'm going to do a whole section on constructive coping mechanisms, which are things that we can do physically and environmentally to make ourselves more resilient. The next one is the ability to seek out support from outside the family. Now, this is an interesting one because um, we have seen in the last generation, almost two now, a diminished capacity for our kids to reach out and get support from outside the family. We think that comes for a couple of reasons. One is because they have technology so that they can look anything up. They don't have to ask about things. They can order pizzas online, etc. So they don't have to talk to anyone. Part of it is because we've been protective emotionally. So from a very young age, if our children said they were uncomfortable ordering their own food at a restaurant or talking to someone they don't know to ask for help, we would talk for them or do that particular activity for them. And so they became less and less confident, therefore less and less capable of really using outside resources. Now, ironically, one of the things that has actually helped in COVID to sort of help with this is that our kids have been put in a position where they have had to do a little more reaching out to resources, talking to their teachers on their own, asking them to explain something or help them with the technology if they were struggling. So it's been good to see that they've been sort of challenged through COVID as a result of COVID to start developing some of these accessing outside resources. We know that a big chunk of kids who launched from high school into the greater world, particularly university settings, ended up leaving simply because they did not have this particular capability. And when they got off on their own, they had to be able to talk to someone at a bank that they were living by. They had to sort out financial issues. They had to talk to financial aid people at a college. They had to directly talk to their own professors. They had all of these outside resources they needed. And some kids were so paralyzed by that that they literally could not continue to function on their own. So this is one arena where you want to be sure and encourage your kids. It's like if you have kids in high school, they should be making their own hair appointments. They should be making their own dental appointments. They should be able to talk to people at the bank. They should be able to, for sure, to order their own pizzas. We've got kids who are leaving high school, have never ordered a pizza other than online, never had to actually talk to someone. So you want to be sure that your kids have that particular capability. So the question is, does outside family mean just outside the household family members? I'm just trying to see what else it said here. Hang on. Yeah, I mean, so they were saying, would aunts and uncles fit in? Certainly, aunts and uncles would be bigger comfort zone than starting with just your family. So then if you're doing aunts and uncles, that's increased your comfort zone to be this much bigger than just family was. But in terms of really functioning and navigating the adult world, they have to be able to talk to people even greater than the more extended family. So that would be looking at, then you'd go the next level. Who else might that be? It might be a school counselor, it might be a teacher. And then they have to go further. It might be someone that they've never talked to before at all or know anything about, like at a bank or a librarian. So we're just going to keep working with these children to get them comfortable getting their needs met through outside resources. Any other questions about that particular skill? Okay, the next one is oops, hang on. Okay, the next one is androgyny. What we know is that people who have and comfortably have a certain level of what we would generally call feminine characteristics and a balance of masculine characteristics, regardless of your gender, are more resilient. So we really want, for example, our children, be they male, female, or other, to be able to be comfortable with having characteristics and not feeling judged or shamed for having characteristics from both what are considered both gender characteristics. That's androgyny. The next one we want to talk about in terms of characteristics or anchors are, just turning my page here, it's stuck. A sense of confidence rather than fear. We know right now, with everything that's sort of happened, that this is one arena that has actually been diminished through COVID and all of the other events that have been happening around us. And so we know there's a certain level of anchors that are more strong at times and less. So right now, because this sense of safety and confidence rather than fear is diminished, we have to look at it in two ways. We have to be sure that other anchors are really in place so that they compensate for this sense of confidence. And we have to be sure that we are still trying to the best of our ability to provide that sense of safety and confidence rather than fear. So, for example, I really like it when kids, let me see what the question is. Let's be more. Hang on. Yep. Okay. So I like it, for example, when instead of just talking to the kids about how dangerous COVID is, we talk about that COVID is dangerous and infectious, and that we have power over protecting ourselves and others by washing our hands, by socially distancing, by wearing masks, so that they have a sense of confidence that that safety to some extent can be mediated by having strategies. So when we're even in situations where we know are obviously diminished arenas of anchors, we're still going to have compensations and compensating strategies to try to deal with our children around. Okay, the next one is manageable expectations. So one of the things is we come from a culture, a very goal-oriented culture. So we get very attached to outcomes. What we do know is that people who are very attached to specific outcomes are less resilient. And so we want our children basically to every day get up, and we want them to think about what is important to them, what has heart and meaning, we call that, to them. We want them to speak their truth, but we want them to do it without criticism or blame. And then we want them to be open to the outcome and not attached to the outcome. So for example, let's say that your children were struggling with something that was happening in online schooling. You would encourage them to speak honestly with their teacher and say what they were struggling with and what they wish she would change or do differently. And that is speaking your truth, doing what has heart and meaning for you, ideally, again, without criticizing the teacher. But the piece that I think a lot of kids really have not grown up with is not being attached to the outcome. And I think it's important for parents to be able to keep working with them to say, call your teacher or talk to your teacher, express what's happening for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean she's going to change what he or she is doing. But speaking your truth is power. And so what I want kids clear about is doing what has heart and meaning and speaking their truth is the power. We don't have control of outcomes. And so when people get too attached to outcomes, it actually makes them more vulnerable, more demoralized, and less resilient. So again, manageable expectations, we call that. You show up, you pay attention to what has heart and meaning for you, You speak your truth without criticism or blame, and you aren't attached to the outcome. Okay, so questions about that. Okay, so practicing gratitude and a sense of abundance is really important. We are less resilient when we think we are in deprivation. And right now, there's a lot of talk um, around us about deprivation. And so it's important to be able to remind your kids, for example, that yes, they are deprived of the freedom to see friends like they used to. Yes, they don't have necessarily the ability to go to on-site school. There are definitely things that they don't have that they used to have. But we want to point out that for most children, they are in that we're talking about right now, most of them have roofs over their head. Most of them have food on their tables and a certain level of comfort with family. Um, most of them live still in abundance. They are not living in deprivation. They are going without things, but they have enough, most. And it doesn't hurt to point out that to your children, if they are old enough, that some people who are also struggling with COVID do not have enough. They do not have the ability to feel safe and comfortable. Okay, yes, we're going to talk about goal setting. Goal setting is appropriate, and I'm going to talk about this particularly in terms of instilling hope. We're going to talk about it in terms of instilling hope. But there's a difference between setting goals and being attached to the outcome of that goal we've set. And it's that attachment I want people to be able to help their kids be more accepting and flexible around. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in instilling hope. Okay, the next one is time. Now, interestingly enough, when we started looking at resiliency studies, one of the things that came up is we know that children particularly are what we call, they are spontaneous processors. And so that means that when they have something on their minds, that's when they want and need to process. But with that said, it's really important to understand that in the last couple generations, particularly as women had the opportunity to get into the workforce, one of the ways that we justified allowing, quotes, allowing women to go into the workforce was to say that it was the quality of time children got, not the amount of time children got from parents, that made a difference. We now know it's a combination. Yes, quality of time is important, but so is the amount of time that children have access to adults that they trust and can process with. Now, when the last generation particularly, we have kept our kids incredibly busy because we have felt like they needed to have all these extracurricular things to compete with other kids that were getting sports and art classes and dance classes, etc., etc. So oftentimes we had full weeks of time where kids had no what we call spontaneous downtime. They would go to school, they would go to extracurricular activities, they would come home and eat, maybe do some schoolwork and go to bed. No spontaneous processing time. Okay, so the question was, I'm just going to read it out loud. How can district staff members positively reinforce students speaking their truth, but letting them know we aren't necessarily changing things? I actually think this is an incredibly good working laboratory for practicing this skill of resiliency, this tool of resiliency. So literally what district staff people can do is they can, one, be sure they are listening Number two, and that part of what is part of listening is really giving students the sense that they are considering what they have to say. So when you listen to a student give you feedback about something, it needs to be important that before they even get it out of their mouth, that you don't say, well, that's not going to happen, or we can't do that, or we're not going to do that. You say, let me consider what you have to say. Let me think about what this is, because it's the considering that is really saying to someone, you're speaking your truth. I'm valuing your speaking what has heart and meaning for you, and that you're being honest. And so I want you really clear that it's important to consider what they have to say. Once you've said and considered what they have to say, then you can say, we considered what you had to say, and we aren't going to be able to change this, or we're not willing to change this, or. So I just want to make it really clear. I want that experience for your children that you're working with, excuse me, that you're not feeling like you have to respond to their need with what they expect. But I also want you to be sure you're considering what they have to say. Okay. All right. So the next one, I want to go back to the time piece. So what I am trying and have been trying to do for several years now is really getting people to sort of step back from staying so busy with their children and having their children involved in so many activities, and sort of begin to prioritize what are the activities that really reflect their child, that your child is most passionate about. But there are times that you are literally just home, not that you are engaging with your kids, but just sitting around, everybody doing their thing. And then you're available for your children to process, what we call process spontaneously. Then what we're seeing is a lot of kids who are and parents who are trying to process at bedtime. Not a good time to process, because you don't want your kids having that kind of anxiety and a lot of thinking when they're trying to relax and go to sleep. The other thing we're seeing, particularly with older kids, is that parents will go to bed and kids will wake them up sometimes 11 or 12 o'clock at night because they have something they want to talk to them about. And parents get really angry about, why are you waking us up to talk about this now? It's because they're spontaneous processors. They have been busy all throughout the day, got through with their schoolwork at 11 or 12, and then realized that there was something that they needed to process with their parent, and therefore they then went in and woke them. So we want to encourage more literally downtime. Now, ironically, one of the things that's been so positive again about COVID is that that processing time has been what we've always been asking for. In fact, if anything, we've got more processing time than we need. But literally, with families home, parents working from home, not being able to have all the extracurricular activities, we've really allowed some of the most healthy processing, spontaneous processing, which is great because right now there is a lot to process. So that has been one of the positives that's happened. The next thing is a sense of purpose. We know that when people feel useful and have a sense that there is something they're doing that has purpose, they are more resilient. And then the last anchor is future orientation. Future orientation is that belief that there is something positive to look forward to in your future. This has been challenging because our kids have seen a lot of negative kinds of messaging, not just since COVID, but for several years, about everything um, from financially, from economics to environment to, and not that we don't have challenges, but we need to be sure our children are getting messages that there are people who are doing amazing, wonderful things, to be sure that we do have a future and that they have a future. So we need to be sure they're aware of the challenges, but also have a reason to have future orientation. Okay, so these are what we call the anchors of resiliency. Before I go on, are there any questions about those particular anchors? It,
Candace,
yes, go
there
ahead,
are a
Becky.
couple questions. I'm just finishing them right now. Just a sec.
You can also just say them out loud, Becky, if you want.
Okay.
You don't, yeah,
Okay, here's the first one. How to give that time and remain sane when I have almost no time to myself and dealing with a very attached 4.5-year-old, and to get him to be open to help from other people when we don't see many people. Even when dad is there, 4-year-old prefers mom always.
yeah. Okay, so this is a great question because one of the things we're going to talk about is how important self-care is. And so I do want parents, they also have to be resilient right now. And self-care is one of the ways that you are staying resilient. So that is a priority of mine. I also want to be really clear that one of the mistakes we've made, for example, I'll use your example of your 4-year-old, is that all children have preferences for what they would like things to be. Our job isn't to keep them comfortable. Is everybody clear about this? Comfort is sort of what we've been giving our children, the message that comfort is the goal in life, and comfort is the goal in their lives. But comfort isn't the goal. What's important is growth. And what's important is capability, efficacy, we call that, more more self-reliance, all of those things are, and the more we have of those, the more competent we are, the more competent we are, the more confident we are, the more confident we are, the more opportunities we have and more potential we have. So keeping our children comfortable is not our goal. So for example, with this 4-year-old, if you have a way to go take care of yourselves and they would prefer that you stayed home and answered questions or met their needs, that's their preference. But I want them to be uncomfortable. You leave. They can be uncomfortable. They still have their dad there. At some point, they will become more comfortable getting those needs met with their dad, and then eventually other people, etc. As they get more comfortable getting those needs met, then they get more confident and competent and are actually going to have greater confidence and comfort again. So we always have comfort, uncomfortableness, which is growth, and then we get back to comfort, and then we get uncomfortable again because we're going to grow. And so I want people clear that, and to be speaking about that their children are, and with their children, about uncomfortable is not bad. Uncomfortable is just the process of growth. Okay, I'm trying to see what else you have here. Okay, I don't see anything else. What else, Becky?
So I have a comment and a question. The comment was that this has been one of the greatest periods ever during my 16 years of parenting 2 daughters because of the extra time and spontaneity. I have never felt closer and more in touch with my kids. It was a huge awakening for me.
Absolutely. And I can't tell you how many other people have had that experience. I mean, I know that it's also challenging because, as the person before you spoke, there is also less ability to do sort of get space and do some self-care. But I have heard many, many people recognizing that relationships were improved and that processing was improved by the whole issue with COVID. So I'm glad you shared that. Okay, so we're going to move. Is that it, or is there another question before I move on?
There's a question. Well, I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
One is, what ideas do you have to help with parents who work and are really busy and have very little time for spontaneous processing themselves?
Okay, so I'm going to answer it in two ways. One is that I think it's really good that they have other people, like they're larger, what we call their circle of caring. Circle of caring are the people that you have in your life that you feel comfortable with, that you feel care for you or concerned for you. So that circle of caring, the larger that circle of caring, the greater our resiliency. We didn't talk about that tonight, but that is one of the resiliency tools, is a larger circle of caring. So getting your kids to have more community, more adult friends that they can talk to, and is always a positive. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think that we as adults also have to sort of step back and say, what things are we prioritizing? Self-care, obviously, I want you to still prioritize. I know that, especially as single parents, it's not a choice if you are working and if you are always, if you're available as much as you would like. But I do think it's important for all of us to sort of step back and reassess where our priorities have been. Is it, for example, is it more important for us to provide our children with fancier homes, more clothing than necessary? Or is it more important to work less and have more accessibility? So I think we all have to keep assessing that. And it's easy to get caught up in sort of the hamster wheel and not really step back sometimes to see if we are intentionally living and providing what we want to live and provide. Okay, so another one, did you say there was one more?
Yes, I texted it to you so you
Oh.
can ignore my text. The question was, how can we help kids recognize their value?
Okay, that's a great question. So we could spend a whole hour talking about this. I'm just going to give you a quick. One of the ways that we help kids understand their value, their purpose, their uniqueness is just that. And we need to allow them to have that authentic self. We need them to be clear that they are worthy, not just for what they do. We're a very goal-oriented culture, as we talked about. Therefore, we're a very to-do culture. And for many people, including adults, let alone children, unless they are doing and doing more, we don't feel worthy. And so we call that positive rewards for doing. And that's fine. We're going to get that, and hopefully your children will get acknowledgement for what they do. But we also need to be sure they're getting equally as much time, what we call positive offerings, for just existing, where they don't have to perform in any way or be doing anything particular, and just being acknowledged and valued for existing. We call that value for existing. And this is where core self-esteem comes from. So it would be doing things like, if your child's sitting and watching TV, you sit down right next to them. You don't go sit across the room. You sit next to them, because that says, I want to be with you. It means walking through a room when they're playing and just kissing the top of their head or ruffling their hair for no reason, just because you're saying they're valuable to you. So we need to be giving both positive offerings for doing, but we need to equally be giving positive offerings for just existing. So that's one way you can do that. The other way we help with value and unique value is we allow kids to be unique. When Johnny comes to you at 3 and says his friend Joe runs faster than he does, I don't want you to say, well, you run fast too. It's like he's starting to assess what he's good at and what other people are good at. You'd say, yeah, Joe is a fast runner. You don't have to say, whoa, you are kind of a turtle, but that undermines their esteem. But you also don't have to say, well, you run as fast as Joe. You're as good a student as Joe. It's like, people have their strengths and people have things they're not particularly strong in. And that's how they figure out what their unique purpose is in life and capability is in life. You can say you can practice running and you'll get faster That's fine if that's one of their goals, but they may never run as fast as Joe. They may never have the capacity to run as fast as Joe because that might be Joe's unique capacity. And so I want children to be able to do some self-assessing and honest self-assessing and not have parents undermine that. As kids get older, some of the ways we undermine it is their children will bring home their grades and they will have 4 A's, a B, and a C. And in the class they have a C, it might say a joy to have in class, works hard, but we're still saying, well, there's no reason why you shouldn't have an A in this class too. It's like, maybe there is a reason. Maybe it is because it doesn't come as naturally. Maybe it is because it is really not their interest, but they are doing the work and they are not disrupting class. Why are we then trying to say that they should be good at everything? How we figure out that unique capacity is figuring out what we are particularly good in and things that we are not particularly good in or particularly interested in. So we have to be careful not to get in the way of them being able to really self-assess as they continue to evolve and develop, and help them learn how to figure out what that unique purpose and value and worth is in their life. Okay, so anybody else, Becky, before we move on?
Nope.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a few tools that also can help. One is normalization. Normalization is being able to sort of get to that acceptance of what normal is. Anything that we resist, anything that we see as abnormal, that are it only gets stronger. And so we want to really try to normalize. When we normalize things, then we are more open and more capable of strategizing and being able to sort of be more resilient in that situation. If there was ever a time to practice normalization, it would be now. It isn't the normal we have known, but this is our new normal. And in our new normal, as we have all seen over the last 9, 12 months now almost, we've seen that as we've come to accept to some extent this new normal, we have gotten better strategies. We've found better ways to connect with people. We have found better ways of trying to work in our jobs. We've learned to accept the new normal and therefore become actually more resilient and more capable again. So normalizing is always really helpful. The next one is connection and rapport. And this comes back to, some of this comes back to time. In order for us to be effective as teachers and as parents, we have to keep a certain level of connection with our children. When that level of connection, what we call rapport, when that level of emotional rapport falters, our ability to effectively teach, affect, coach also falters. And so it's incredibly important to keep those connections as positive and as tight as possible. So again, I think in COVID, we've had a little bit better chance because we've had more time to sort of build those relationships. The way you connect with people, the easiest way to rebuild as we start to falter is to do one-on-one, 2 to 3 times a week, 20 to 30 minutes, no fail fun. Let me say it again. The sort of formula for rebuilding connection is one-on-one, 2 to 3 times a week for 20 to 30 minutes, doing something no fail fun. Now, with that said, there's a reason we say 20 to 30 minutes. It doesn't help to do 2 or 3 hours because in 2 or 3 hours, there's a very good chance something will break down and it won't be no fail fun. 20 or 30 minutes is about how long we can sustain no fail fun. So you're looking for these short periods of time. Now, when that comes up, I'll hear parents say, well, I have 3 children. I don't know how I would have time to build rapport with all 3 of my children. You don't have to build rapport with all 3 of your children at the same time. It's only when you feel it's faltering. So there might be 1 child a week that may be faltering, or maybe it's your partner this week where the rapport is faltering, and that's where you'll put your energy. So your job isn't to try to sustain every relationship at its peak all the time. That's impossible to have that kind of balance. What you want to get good at is recognizing who in the system you particularly need to work on your rapport with and put your energy there. So that's connection and rapport. So questions about that?
No questions so far.
Okay. The next tool is creativity. We know that any form of creativity increases your self-esteem, increases your sense of resiliency. So that can be simply buying a new fruit at the grocery store. That could be moving furniture around. And we want to encourage children to be thinking of creativity as a resiliency tool and not be thinking of creativity as necessarily just an art project. That creativity could be doing things in their room differently. It could be getting a new haircut. So we want kids to really practice creativity, and that means we have to model a greater idea and a greater model for really using creativity as a way of being more resilient in our own lives as adults. The next one is centering. Centering is that ability to come back from a state of discord, a state of um, disappointment, frustration, anger, etc., of emotional discord, back to a place of well-being. That's what we call centering. People center in all kinds of ways. They center tactily. That means they are people who might play with their hair or rub something soft. They're tactile centers. There are oral centers. Those of you who have sport bottles and kind of use your sport bottle. People who eat for centering, those are oral centers. Those of you who or your children bite their fingernails. Biting your fingernails is not a bad habit. It's an oral centering activity. There's visual centering, going outside, looking at nature, looking at beautiful pictures, watching TV, visual centers. Auditory centers, listening to music, listening to podcasts, listening to nature sounds. They're auditory centers. There are kinesthetic centers, people who rock to center, people who twist their rings, or they have to knit in order to stay centered. They are kinesthetic centers. We all have a preference of centering. The larger our rapport, the larger our repertoire of centering activities, the more likely we are to get back to that place of well-being, no matter what situation we're in and what we're doing. So our goal is for ourselves and to help our children is to get that actual number of ways they know how to center increased, and that they're conscious about moving towards those things when they are feeling in emotional discord. So that's what we talk about when we talk about centering. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about is self-care. And I said I would come back to this when we were talking about that as one of the basic anchors of resiliency. So in terms of self-care, there's a couple things I want people to be clear about. The people need to get out and they need to get away, preferably in nature, including parents. We need to get space away from our everyday lives. We need to connect with friends. We need to do things that are self-nurturing. There's a difference between being sort of building self-esteem, taking a class, accomplishing maybe a scarf that you finish knitting. Those are building self-esteem. Self-nurturing would be things like having a piece of your favorite chocolate, making yourself a cup of tea, um, picking out your favorite music to listen to. Those are self-nurturing activities. So we need to really amp up and be conscious of doing self-nurturing. Daydreaming is huge. It's sort of soulfulness to daydream. And so we need to get adults daydreaming more, which they are oftentimes too busy to daydream. And so that's part of the reason we're trying to pull back and get people to reprioritize how they're spending time. But we also want to be sure your children are daydreaming. And one of the things I'll oftentimes see, because we're such a to-do culture, is that children have that natural ability to daydream. And we'll walk past their bedroom door and they'll be sitting on their bed, quotes, doing nothing. And we'll say, "What are you doing?" Or, "What are you thinking?" You're getting in the way of that unique self-care ability, which is daydreaming. So if you see your kids sitting there doing nothing, leave them alone. That's probably soulfully feeding them in some way. Um, Prioritizing fun is huge. And again, I've heard people talk about that at first that was very challenging with COVID, but then one of the gifts of COVID is that people have really oftentimes expanded the ways that they have had fun with their families in ways they had forgotten or they were even capable of doing. Board games, charades, I've heard some people talk about. So being sure that you're prioritizing fun. And this is huge because as we struggle, especially with online school, sometimes what's happening is we're prioritizing that over fun all the time. That undermines rapport. That's undermining your kid's sense of balance and well-being. So we need to be sure that through this whole process that we can step back and be sure that sometimes we have to let what looks like we should do go in order to get that balance and prioritize fun. Did you have a question for me, Becky? Any questions?
Nope.
Okay,
Sorry.
all right. And then the last thing I wrote under tools was limiting exposure to news. And I know that's very hard, particularly right now with so much going on. But, generally we can watch once or twice a day or read once or twice a day. What we do know is that it definitely undermines resilience to be bombarded with a lot of what looks like intense or scary or overwhelming kinds of information. So I'm asking people to be conscious about limiting your own exposure and your children's exposure to news right now. Okay, we're going to talk about health practices now.
Candice,
Yes.
I do have another question. I find myself battling my son frequently over his choice of clothing, mainly clothes that will keep him warm and dry while he is outside in the rain.
Okay, so in terms of clothing, the only thing that I want parents to ever intervene about literally would be health and safety. Now, one of the things about living in the Northwest that is, I think it's challenging because I think parents oftentimes feel judged by other parents if they aren't dressing their kids' quotes appropriately. But the truth is, we very rarely even get to freezing in here. And most of the time we're in the 40s and 50s, even in the winter. And so many children temperamentally do not like both the feel of clothing and or getting too hot, and actually can um, trigger them to have behavioral issues and responses if they get too hot or if they are having clothing that's irritating them. So we'll see children from literally from preschool all the way up through high school that only wear shorts. They wear shorts all year around. They don't wear jackets. They don't like things around their neck. Now, if it was really an issue of exposure where they were literally going to be, it's going to be a health and safety issue, you would say, today it's health and safety. You have to have, wear something where you're not going to have that exposure. Most of the time it is not health and safety. It's more just that we feel like they are or we're going to be judged if they don't have raincoats on or warmer clothing. It's okay to say, to insist that they bring a coat with them, for example, and say, I don't care if you wear your coat, but you need to bring a coat in case you need it. So try not to get into battles around clothing unless it truly is health and safety. Okay. All right. Any other questions before I move on?
No questions.
All right. Let's talk about health practices. I want to remind people that there needs to be 9 hours of sleep, not to be start to begin to go down the road of sleep deprivation. So even with high schoolers, we saw a lot of sleep deprivation. Sometimes we are doing better right now with online than we were on site, simply because kids were staying up late and then having to get up so early to get to school on time. So they were getting 6, 7 hours of sleep, which is 3 hours less. They need 9 hours of sleep. So really being clear with your kids that you really want them to try to figure out schedules that they can get ideally 9 hours of sleep daily. The second one is physical activity. Incredibly challenging right now. A lot of the physical activities your kids got were at recess for younger kids, or PE at school, or their after school sports, or just running around with friends. And so with a lot of that isolation and a lot of those activities limited, our kids have struggled with getting enough exercise. It is incredibly important. They should be getting ideally 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes of activity, really extensive activity every day. And so trying to get your kids outside, trying to go for walks, trying to get them on bikes, anything you can do to do that, because it affects also their mental health as well as their physical health. So physical exercise. Brain breaks are really a good time to be active. I'm asking people, brain breaks are when you stop school. Those should happen every 40 to 45 minutes. You should have like a 10 to 15-minute brain break. Those are good times to encourage kids to go be physical, jump around, go outside, go for a walk. It's what you don't want to encourage would be screen time during that time. So avoiding screens during brain breaks. Okay, so and then in terms of self-care, you want routines, but you don't want to have rigidity. So you want routines and structure without rigidity. And we talked about this before when we were talking about this transition, which is you want to set up what will be their regular online school area so that they can walk into it with ease and really begin to focus right away. But you also don't want to be rigid about how that space might evolve or change depending on their needs. Or you might intend that they are engaged in their classes for the whole 40-45 minutes, but you're not going to be rigid about it, because you may recognize on a certain day that there is another need that is circumventing that being the outcome. And so you may break off at 20 minutes and go take a break outside or go do something fun. So I want people to have that structure and routine in place, but I want you to be flexible around that routine and not rigid. Okay, nutrition, regular healthy meals are important. Nutritious snacks are important and kind of forgotten since we're home oftentimes. And a big one that people are leaving out is plenty of hydration. Be sure that you have water bottles or some form access of liquids by your kids while they're online schooling, for example. And then,
Candice,
yes,
I have a couple comments about the exercising part and a question.
okay,
Getting their kids interested in walking or outside is a challenge. If kids are bored with going for walks, as and many of our current options, how do we get them to go on walks with us or do other exercises and
it is.
motivating them?
It is really challenging. And I want to say to people, it's like, do not feel bad. This is one of those times when an impetus, a good bribe, goes a long way. If you can walk to some place where they can get a treat, it's worth saying, let's walk to the bakery and I'll buy you a treat. But you've gotten them out and had a brisk walk for 20 minutes, for example, or saying that if you'll, do this activity with me, go on this short hike or walk around the lake or whatever it might be, that you'll stop and get a drink at Starbucks, or, so anything like that. Where I'm also noticing that people are finding that they're doing much better now about, rather than that kind of thing, they're doing better with seeing if kids will go on bike rides with them, again, using that same impetus, but also thinking more creatively. Like I've heard people starting to dance and turning on music and getting silly and dance. And even with older kids, I've heard people talk about doing more sort of roughhousing and wrestling. I've heard people talk about setting up um, like badminton sets in the house, in a room, in an empty room, where they can do ping pong or badminton. So, again, I think as we really accept a new normal, we get more creative about trying to meet some of those needs in ways we hadn't considered before. Okay, and there was another one. Was there another one?
No, they were all pretty much that on
The
that
same.
same level.
Yeah. And I think it's probably one of the most challenging things. And of course, living in the Northwest, it's even more challenging because, as we all know, it's not as fun to walk in the rain. It's
Yeah.
not as comfortable.
And I had
So
another comment too that, if you can't exercise with your kids because of two major surgeries in 5 months, how do you have any suggestions on how to support that type of challenge?
yeah, again, I think I'd go back to what I was talking about earlier, where you're more focused on provision than you are necessarily engagement. So that would be, trying to set things up where they had indoor kinds of physical games they could play. Um, and so that it's really about encouraging and setting the environment up rather than having to actually engage them in that. Same idea. Okay, so let's talk about social. And then the last one in that last arena was limiting recreational screen time. I want to remind people again, we're now talking about recreational screen time, which would be outside of online school. And so recreational screen time now should still not be any longer than 2 hours per day. And that would be gaming, social media, television. Those are what we call recreational screen time. And so trying to really hold those to 2 hours a day. Okay, social concepts that help. Empathy, that ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to recognize what someone else might be feeling, is really an important tool right now for us to both model and encourage in our children. Benevolence, that's the ability to have grace towards somebody's idiosyncrasies or faults. And again, to help your children develop and normalize that no one is perfect, that everyone has things that are annoying. We are stuck with each other. And what's going to help us be resilient being stuck with each other is really valuing benevolence. That same benevolence is what gives us a sense as human beings, with people who are around us and care for us, of unconditional love. It's what feeds that strong attachment I was talking about for resiliency. So those are closely tied together. Differentiation is another concept we can be working on right now. Differentiation is that ability to recognize difference without judgment. So it would be looking at things and saying, you love online school and it isn't challenging. Your brother really dislikes it and finds it very challenging. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong, nobody's better. They're just different. We prefer different foods. We like different temperatures. We laugh at different things. So getting used to really helping your kids recognize difference without judgment. Cost and entitlements, another really big concept to work on right now. Cost and entitlements is helping your kids recognize that every experience they have in their life has a cost, and every experience they have has a gift. And so, for example, we named one tonight. One of the costs of COVID was that we were unable to go out and engage with other people. One of the entitlements was that we were able to have more time developing relationships with our children. So there are costs and entitlements, costs and gifts to every experience we have. We oftentimes recognize and point out the costs, and our children hear a lot about the costs, which feeds back into me talking earlier about living in deprivation or believing they live in deprivation. So it's important that we model and encourage assessing what the benefits are or what the entitlements are of an experience, even if it's a challenging experience. Okay, the next one is respect. If there was ever a time that we were to work on respect, it would be now for all kinds of reasons. And so when we talk about the respect, and again, we could spend hours talking about this, but I'm just going to give you a quick um, sort of overview. Respect, the important piece I want for your children is for them to understand respect is a behavior of integrity. It is not a feeling. We can agree with someone, we can disagree with someone, we can like someone, we can dislike someone. But if we are people of integrity, then we treat people respectfully. And so there are 4 behaviors of respect. Those are trust in the ability of another, recognize and own our part of a problem, recognize and accept that people have feelings different than our own, and interested in the point of view of another other than our own. So those are the 4 sort of basic respectful behaviors. So questions about that?
No questions.
Okay, the last one is misdirected emotion. Right now, we are all laden with all kinds of emotions, and that is normal. So that's normalizing that. So you're not resisting it. We just have a lot of emotions right now in play. But what's important is not to misdirect those emotions. So when we are frustrated with how much we are not accomplishing with at-home work, at-home employment, we need not to misdirect that and yell at our kids for having a messy room. Our kids may be frustrated with the challenge of online schooling, but they need not to put a sibling down or mistreat a parent. That's misdirected emotions. It's important for us to recognize what we're feeling and then move on from there. Yeah, the aspects of respect are interest in the point of view of another other than your own. The second is trust in the ability of another. The third is recognize and accept your part of a problem. The fourth is recognize and accept others have feelings different than your own even sharing the same experience. I'll say them one more time because they're kind of complex. Trust in the ability of another. Recognize and own your part of a problem. Recognize and accept others have feelings different than your own, even sharing the same experience. And interest in the point of view of another other than your own. That's the 4. Okay, so I just want to remind people a couple things really quickly about this. One is, it's so important right now to have grace, to have compassion for yourself and for your children. That is incredibly important. I want you to be clear that you aren't going to get everybody's needs met right now, that we won't always be in balance, that I want to normalize that we have to sort of step back and prioritize on a daily basis who needs our attention, what needs our attention, and not feel guilty or not feel like we haven't been responsible or capable. No one is able to do that right now. I also want to be really clear that we have worked and talked about resiliency for years in terms of it being a particularly important parenting goal, is to develop resiliency in our children. We did that because we knew we would have adversity and that they would have adversity in their lives. They do have adversity right now. And what I want to remind and reassure people is this is what you've been working on. This is why you've been working on resiliency, and to trust that your children are going to be okay through this. So questions about that?
No questions.
Okay, and did everybody get the respect, or do you need me to put it back out again? Because I have a please repeat the respect thing. Is that from before?
Yes, and Lori typed it in the chat for everyone.
Okay.
So we're good.
Okay. All right. So we're going to shift right now to instilling hope in children and adolescents. So I want to talk a little bit about understanding what hope is, etc. Because one of the things that I'm seeing is that children are feeling hopeless. And I'm sitting here looking because my kitten is about ready to climb on the computer. And so that I'm finding that kids are feeling like someone else is supposed to give them hope. And I feel like parents are feeling like somehow it is their job to make their kids hopeless and instill hope in them. And that is a very powerful approach to that with our children. I want us to understand where hopefulness comes from. And then I want us to teach our children, coach our children, how to be hopeful people, so that they aren't powerlessly looking for that hope to come outside them. Is everybody clear about that? Okay, so let me explain first what hope is. So optimism, when we talk about people being optimistic, and I think we have talked about learned optimism before in some of these workshops in the past, that optimism is the belief that good things will happen in the future. It's really good to have optimism. We know that people who are optimistic and believe good things will happen in the future are more resilient. But hope is taking it a step further. Hope is when you believe you can find ways to achieve someone's goals and motivate yourself to have those things you're visualizing for the future. So earlier someone said to me, is it good to have goals? Absolutely, it's good to have goals. They are the vision of hope. But what's important is to understand that we can't be sometimes attached to the outcome of some of those goals, because we have to readjust them depending on what's happened and so on. So the components of hope are threefold. They are goals, having a vision, goals or a vision; pathways, which is a plan, that we have to have a plan to get to that vision or that goal. And then efficacy, or what we call personal efficacy, is what we call ability. The ability, the tools we need in order to follow our plan to get to the goals. So when we're working with children, we need them to have all three of those things and understand that all three of those things need to be in place for them to feel hopeful, and that we want them to come from within them, not from without them, because that is the way we're going to keep them feeling hopeful. So ways that we can help them with this is we can help them build a future focus, talk about what they would like to happen in the future, what they hope will happen in the future, what they're daydreaming about what will happen in the future. And then we can work with them on plans and strategies to get to those goals for the future. And when they get stuck, we can help them sort of begin to think about ways or what tools they might need in order to do that. It might be they need resources, outside resources. It might be that they need to come up with a new strategy because they have to adapt. Okay, so the definition of hope, someone asked for the definition, is when you believe you can find ways to achieve your goals, motivate yourself to try and follow those ways. That's hope. It's internal. It's not going to come from outside us. It has to come from within us. And that's what makes us feel powerful. So and the three components. So we want to really encourage them to keep finding new strategies. If their strategies aren't working because they don't have a particular skill, then we talk to them about the strategy of acquiring that skill, acquiring that ability in some way, so that they can continue to move toward that goal. So all three of those things should be in place and dynamic. And by dynamic, I mean not attached to the outcome, that we are constantly evolving those three components in order to keep feeding us moving forward and feeling hopeful. Okay, the other thing we want to do is we want to foster gratitude, awareness that we live in abundance, as we talked about earlier. We want them to recognize that they live in abundance. That doesn't mean they have to be content. They can still want more. They can still be visualizing more. They can still be looking for goals, so that contentment isn't necessarily what I mean when I say foster gratitude, but to be aware that we still have a lot of abundance, and we have things that we would like to have different um, or more or whatever. So we want to help them recognize the difference between just repeat. We want them to help to recognize the difference between dreams and goals. So dreams are kind of like wishing and hoping. It's just something that you're visualizing, you're daydreaming about. And sometimes our kids get confused because they feel like if they have a big enough dream, a big enough wish, that is going to come true. But then they are powerless, they're discouraged, they're disappointed. I want them to recognize the dream is kind of like, or kind of like the first step. It's like you have a dream, and then you make a goal to reach that dream, and then you start your pathway and work on your abilities to try to achieve that what may have started with a dream. So dream may be the beginning of having a vision or a goal, but you can't stop with a dream. That is a powerless place to stop. That's just wishing and hoping if you don't move to the next step. Then we want to foster curiosity and a willingness to experiment. As we are working with our kids to sort of be straight A students or really good at sports or art or whatever, and we start feeding perfectionism, the more perfectionistic our kids become, the less willing they are to experiment and be curious about trying something new and different. What we know is that hopefulness comes from that ability to really be curious and continue to experiment that helps us then get more strategies and more abilities. Okay, helping them recognize every experience has a form of value and benefit. We talked about that with resiliency as well, that when people recognize value and benefit, not just costs, that they are both more resilient and more hopeful. Um, Staying mindful, staying in the present. We are a culture that has a very difficult time with mindfulness. It is not built into many of our cultural daily belief behaviors. And so I think more so all the time, we're seeing more and more people work on yoga, um, running, spiritual practices, meditation. So we're seeing people start to become aware of how important mindfulness is. But part of what mindfulness does is it keeps us focused on the present so that we make the most of the present. When we make the most of the present, we don't feel the same deprivation or need to have someone constantly feed that sense that there's something more and better out there. So we want to get more mindful in every way you can, both modeling and providing ways for your children to be mindful. You want to build on past successes and experiences. It's how that sense of capability is built. This is where we talked about that small comfort zone and pointing out to kids that it's like you used to only be able to do this, now you can do this. And, if you continue to experiment and explore and practice, you can get to here and here. So we really want our kids to really have that sense that they are building on their successes and continuing to get more and more capable and confident. We also want to encourage them to help other people and volunteer. One of the things we know is that when we feel like we are engaged in something bigger than ourselves, we feel more hopeful. That has just come up in time after time after time in researching hopefulness. And so encouraging your children to help other people or help the environment, etc., that sense of purpose we talked about in resiliency is likely to have the same effect on your child's hopefulness. And then the last thing I want to talk about around hopefulness is to talk about what we call stories. And one of the things we know is that when families share stories about their families, stories about their lives, stories about other people's lives, that it is really helpful in producing more hopeful, a sense of more hopefulness. Now, there are three kinds of stories. There are ascending stories. This would be a story, for example, um, I'll come back to the volunteering. I see the question, I'll come back to it. Um, so again, so the stories are ascending. That would be that our family came from Italy with nothing, and grandpa started this small shop front, and it grew and grew and grew, and then he had this business, and now we all have a lot of comfort, nice homes, etc. Those are ascending stories. Even those feed hopefulness. Descending stories are stories like we came from Europe, and in World War II, grandma and grandpa were put in a concentration camp. Grandpa did not survive, and then we had to start over again. In and and then the story. Those are descending stories. But even descending stories, interestingly enough, are help children feel hopeful, because generally those descending stories, they see people have survived and are coming back up. So there's still hopefulness. The most effective stories are what we call undulating stories. Undulating stories are talking about how, well, this happened and then this kind of happened. We sort of lost this, but then we came back and got this, and then this happened. Those are undulating life stories. Most of us, almost all of us, live undulating lives. Very few people have just ascending stories. Very few people have just descending stories. Most people have undulating stories. And that's good because those are the stories that actually provide our children to have more hopeful sense of future, are the undulating stories. So I had a question about how can kids help others and volunteer during this time. Granted, it is more challenging right now for kids to be in that position, but it can be simple things. It can be things like offering an elderly neighbor to walk their dog for them, and using good safety practices in terms of that. It could be bringing meals to people. It could be doing Zoom calls. I've had kids that have done little plays for neighbors outside. I've had people who have um, provided music for people, played instruments outside to someone. So there are different ways. I think, again, the thing that I want people to look at here is part of the value of the challenge is the creativity that, and really using that muscle for learning how to creatively strategize challenging things. So just being conscious about how important it is, not to necessarily that it isn't easy necessarily to think of how we can help others right now, but it certainly is an interesting exercise to come up with ways that we could do that. Can you limit more time, limiting screen time in the era of COVID? Okay, so people want to talk about limiting screen time. So part of what happened, and necessarily happened and gratefully happened, because I think this would have been a whole lot harder on all of us and our children had we not had screens to help us during COVID, connect with people, distract ourselves, etc. But over spring and summer, as a result of parents having to work, of kids not being able to socialize, and entertain or have the activities they had in the past, we got into a lot of more screen time. And that was just a necessary thing, and no guilt around it, no judgment around it. As school started, we hoped that just by doing online school, that would begin to mediate the issue. And it does mediate the issue in the sense that if kids are doing online school, which is not called recreational, so we're talking about necessary time and then recreational. And there's kind of a fine line, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But in terms of recreational, it's by the time kids do 5, 6 hours of schooling, some homework, probably some household chores, ideally some exercise, ideally some form of socialization with peers, which may be online, by the way. So when I talk about recreational screen time, I'm talking about gaming, I'm talking about social media, maybe perhaps television to some extent. So those should only be about 2 hours. But really, 2 hours is not that hard to sort of limit when you figure how much you're spending doing all the other things that we ideally should be doing, helping around the house, getting exercise, and so on. So that's is ideally getting more mediated right now. Again, I think part of this is having to figure out how to set boundaries so that screen time, recreational screen time, doesn't come, for example, before they exercise or before they do chores, that kind of thing, so that by the time all the things that are what we would call more necessary life kinds of engagement happen before screen time. Okay, so questions, anybody else? So that's basically it on the hopefulness and the resiliency. So just open to questions now.
I don't have any at the moment, but maybe we can give it a second.
Okay.
Okay, I have a couple.
Okay.
What should we do when we notice our kids were really overly attached to a failed outcome?
Okay. So, again, it's like, this is something in our culture, our society, that is a challenge even for adults. And so I don't expect children right now, especially because they haven't necessarily even had a very good model of not being attached to outcomes. So, it's think of them as not being very evolved yet, but that you're going to talk about that. Like at a calm time, not in the moment while they are still trying to process that high intensity emotion of some sense of disappointment. Um, but later to go back and talk about for everyone, for adults, for everyone, that we do our best, we pay attention to what is heart meaning, do our best, and we can't be attached to the outcome because we don't always have control over that outcome. And so we want to talk about that process, number one, so they understand that that is normal at any age. We want to model it. We want to show that with our best intentions, if that is trying a new recipe and it tastes horrible, that we can laugh about that, but grow from it. We also want to work with our kids about really understanding the difference between learning and knowing. And especially for really intelligent, capable children, they have a very hard time with not being attached to outcomes because they've been so used to being successful at almost everything they do, or think they are successful almost everything they try. So when they hit something that they don't have a good outcome on, they're just defeated and don't recover very well. They don't have a lot of resiliency. It's because it feels to them like they need to know. And I want them to have a model from you guys that learning is a lifelong process, that even adults don't know everything, that adults are constantly learning, and that and they will be constantly learning, that knowing is really not a big deal. What's a big deal is learning and learning more and getting more competent. So it's really a mindset that we want to start working with as early as possible with our children, so that they have a different perspective to start with rather than have to undo that at 17 or 18 in order to sort of be able to restructure and be more resilient as they enter adult life. Okay, what was the other question?
Well, I have three more.
Oh, okay.
Well, four actually.
Okay.
How do you respond when people say, well, children are resilient, they'll be okay?
Um, I would say for the most part, there's probably a lot of accuracy in that. Is that generally most of the kids we see have most of these resiliency anchors in place. They have communities, they have attachments, they have food and clothing, they have. So for most kids, they are going to be resilient. They are going to be able to bounce back from this adversity. Now, there are times and situations where the adversity is so extended, so long, or so intense that they don't bounce back. And that would be, for example, we know that people survive, children survive in inner city situations that can be horrific, but sometimes they aren't necessarily resilient. They don't bounce back. They aren't, they struggle and never are successful with school. They may get drug or alcohol addicted. They don't bounce back soulfully. They survive, but they don't bounce back soulfully. But for the most part, when we have those resiliency anchors in place, most of us will have children that are resilient. They don't have to like it, they don't have to be comfortable. It doesn't mean they don't have grief and loss, but this will not be the first or the last grief or loss that they have to deal with. And so for the most part, when someone says your kids will be okay, it's like, I don't want to be so flippant as to say, I don't want them to not be considered. I don't want us to work on resiliency. I don't want us to work on strategies to diminish the adversity that they struggle with through this. But I do believe for the most part, they are resilient.
Okay, thank you. How to limit screen time when we use it for younger kids while helping older kids with school.
Yeah, I mean, this is the complexity I was talking about, that sometimes it's a matter of survival to try to keep younger kids, for example, entertained while you're dealing with older kids. Sometimes socialization, which is a necessity right now, can only come safely with screen time. And so this is that part when I was talking about, I want people to have structure. I want them to have routines, and I want them not to be rigid and judgmental, and have a level of flexibility. So, and here's where differentiation comes in. I don't want parents of those preschool children who are online as a way of keeping them distracted and entertained while they're working with older siblings in school. I don't want them to feel guilty. I don't want them to have to feel like, well, my friend said her kids only get an hour of screen time a day and my kids are on 4. It's like everybody is doing the best they can. Everybody has different circumstances. When we talk about these things, we're talking about what we would like to see, shoot for as some of the ideals. But as we talked about, part of what makes us resilient is the ability to differentiate, the ability to not be attached to some of these outcomes. So do the best you can. If the way you are going to be able to work with your kids in school right now is to have your youngers online, so be it. That's what you're doing. And there's no shame in that. There should be no judgment in that. It's the best you can do right now. And as time goes on, you will have strategies and structures that will help you evolve into something different when that's no longer a necessary activity. Okay, another
Okay,
one?
so another screen time. It's probably up. This parent comments it's probably up to 5 or 6 hours one day a week, but then they don't have any screens on the other 6 days, and it seems to work for them. But they're curious if you have an opinion on if we should balance it out throughout the week rather than having one free day. The kids are
Again,
4.5 and 7.
here's that differentiation, is that for some people that might work, and I'm happy if it works for you and your family. And for some people that would absolutely not work, because their child would probably have a dopamine um, release, a big dopamine release, which happens with screen time, gaming, social media, etc. And then they would have a huge dopamine withdrawal. Your child may not have a big dopamine withdrawal where they are bored, where they're agitated, where there's nothing else they want to do when they're done. That's the dopamine withdrawal. So all of us and all of our brains are a little different. And so some people are just more receptive to that dopamine withdrawal, or more affected, I should say, by that dopamine withdrawal. And so, so maybe it is fine for your family to do it that way. They're still not getting, more than average of 2 hours a day that way. But I would want them to be aware that in terms of vulnerability, when the sort of longer, the more you have of that regularly, the more that pathway is being developed. So they could possibly be more vulnerable to addiction, to that form of addiction, screen time addiction. So it's really one of those things that it's like knowing the concepts, knowing what it is that we need to watch for and why, that is going to make a difference on the strategies that we come up with our families. Okay. Anyone else?
Okay. Can you talk more about perfectionism and anxiety in a 6-year-old?
So perfectionism and anxiety are closely tied together. We often see that. We know that oldest and only children are more likely to be perfectionists. Um, we know that there is a genetic predisposition there, that oftentimes anxiety is um, comes because we already have that genetic predispositions genetically. So it could be yourself, it could be a partner, it could be a grandparent, uh, a sibling, an aunt and uncle, etc. But there is a genetic predisposition for that. And then there are particularly developmental ages that our kids are more anxious. 6 generally is not one of those. We usually see more anxiety at 7. So a lot of anxiety at 7, 9, um, 11, 13. So we have certain ages where children are more anxious, and when they're genetically predisposed and then they interface that with one of those developmental ages, we'll see anxiety sort of go up. Um, we know that there is sort of that gender birth order piece that I was talking about, oldest and only, and part of that comes from that we are generally so enamored with our first children because they're magical. I mean, watching them learn to roll over, learn to walk, learn to talk. I mean, we were thrilled and they farted the first time. We were so excited. It's like we were so enamored that they got all this sort of thing about performing, and that they had to do all these things more and more and more in order to sort of get that, or believe they did, to get that kind of energy. So it doesn't take long to get that perfectionism going, but it's incredible burden, and definitely undermines resilience, definitely undermines creativity, definitely it's pretty soul killing over time, those of you who are adults with perfectionism. Um, and so we want to work on it as early as possible, and that is working on that knowing versus learning, and normalizing that. We want to help them understand that mistakes sometimes turn out better than when they don't make a mistake, or that if they make a mistake, it is a learning opportunity. Um, we want them to see adults make mistakes, and from children's point of view, sometimes it looks like adults don't make mistakes. So being sure that you are modeling when you make a mistake, and not saying negative things about that. Not expecting your children to be good at everything is really important. So there are all these little tools that we can start at. The younger we start working, 6 is really young. And so to start working with your child at 6 on this is probably an incredible gift that will keep them from struggling with this so much at 17 and 18. So, or into adulthood. Okay. So other questions?
Okay, it looks like one more. What are some good ways for kids to get emotional releases in this time, preferably without screaming at family members?
Okay, so definitely here's where the physical comes in. We know that that has been an incredible, the inability to get the physical exercise has been incredible impact on kids' emotional well-being. So any way that you can get them very, physical inside or outside is super important to get that physical outlet. Um, the other is any other kind of release. Like we know that humor, laughter is really good. So, people have been saying, well, I've been really not wanting my kids to do screen time. And I'm like, look up some funny movies, look up some funny cartoons or something where they're going to laugh because that is a release for kids. Um, and sadly enough, is what's so challenging about this, so is whining and crying. But if that's the only way they can release, it's like we have to have a certain level of benevolence and tolerance that those may escalate right now because they don't have other healthier ways to release. But we're going to keep modeling centering. That's that ability to come back to that place of well-being. So really helping them build their repertoire of centering activities. And then all these other things we talked about, and then being sure we model it, because we can talk till we're blue in the face about misdirecting emotion or having to get centered or all these other things we've talked about, getting physical exercise. But if we're not modeling it, it's just words. So it's like we have to really walk the talk on these concepts in order for them to really get instilled in our children. Okay, anyone else?
No, it looks like that was the last one.
Okay, sounds good. It was great, you guys. Thanks for showing up tonight.
Thank you so much, Candice. We really
You-
appreciate you.
You're so welcome. And we'll talk again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, everybody.